Darkcast Network. Welcome to the dark side of podcasting.
A 15-year-old boy finishes his nightly chores and goes to bed. But the next morning, when his mother tries to wake him up for school, he's gone. That's what happened on the night of February 25th, 2024, when Sebastian Rogers was last seen in his Hendersonville, Tennessee home. What at first seemed to be a teenager walking off in the middle of the night has turned into a much more complex case involving multiple searches, possible sightings, internet sleuthing, and a lot of mudslinging. When a person goes missing, there's a special kind of pain in the not knowing. I want to tell you the stories of those who never came home. Today, I want to tell you the story of Sebastian Rogers. I'm Kona Gallagher.
And I'm Ethan Flick.
And this is And Then They Were Gone. Welcome back, everyone.
Welcome back. We're alive.
We're alive. Thank you for joining us once again. So sorry about that unexpected hiatus, but let's first introduce ourselves. I'm Kona.
And I'm Ethan.
And we're the husband and wife team behind this podcast. Each week, or thereabouts, I tell you the story of an unsolved missing persons case. Ethan doesn't know anything about the case going into the episode, and he is here to provide his reactions and questions in real time, hopefully asking some of the same ones you have at home. So, for those of you who have been listening to us for a while, you know that I'm a realtor. And despite the high interest rates that we are currently going through, this spring market has been wild for me. And
in a good way, though.
In a good way. Well, in a good way for my job. Yeah. For like making our mortgage payments, but in a bad way for this podcast because I've just had so many appointments and I've been out and about so much that like the time that I usually have to sit down and write these episodes and research them, which is hours and hours and hours it takes to do every episode, I just simply have not had.
You've expanded your area too. So like, now you have further to go.
Well, exactly. Yeah. So we're in Northern Virginia. We're in the DC area. And I've also gotten my West Virginia license. So I now work in the Eastern Panhandle of West Virginia. So that's like the Charlestown, Harpers Ferry type area.
So if anybody out there, any of our listeners are in that area.
And actually, I have been working with a couple of our listeners.
Oh, that's awesome.
Yeah. I shout out to Andrea and Nick. Andrea listens to the show and looked me up because they were looking for a house in the area. And then Maddie, your coworker, who is also a listener of the show.
Diehard listener. Shout out to you, Maddie.
Yes. I've been helping her try to find a place too. So it's weird because it's like, you know, hey, if you need a house and you listen to the show, I'd love to help you. But also it may contribute to like the show not getting out in a timely fashion. Also, I briefly went to Sweden. But we don't need to get into all that. If you're on our TikTok, you've seen some of the videos. Anyway. All right. With all the blathering, let's, kind of get started on this show. Now, this episode I wanted to do as like our big kind of return show. And it's, if you we're listening to the context clues, very recent.
Mm-hmm.
February 26th, 2024 was when Sebastian was reported missing. So he was last seen physically on the 25th, but then went to bed and so kind of disappeared sometime in the early morning hours of the 26th. This case, like I said, it seemed pretty straightforward. It really did seem as though he just walked off. Now, Sebastian is on the autism spectrum.
Okay.
And while walking off wasn't something that he had necessarily done before, it seems to be the most logical conclusion. Like, there's no sign of foul play. He wasn't like out in public. He was home in his bed, so it didn't seem like a random abduction or anything like that. It also didn't seem like anything necessarily happened in the home or anything of that nature. So that's kind of what they were thinking. And I was, like a lot of these cases, kind of keeping an eye on it. But it wasn't solved, and it kept on not getting solved, which, I did find surprising. And then what finally got me to write this episode was a picture that was released that appeared to show Sebastian in a completely different state. And it was a very credible photo. And we'll obviously really get into that in the episode. But like, it really felt as though we just needed to get this out there a little bit more in order to kind of get more ears listening to his story, more eyeballs on his photo, just to kind of keep an eye out.
Just more exposure in general.
Yeah, basically, because it has made national news now. But, you can always use more. A quick disclaimer, though, about this. If you've been following this case like closely online, which I'm sure some of you have who are listening right now, like there is a ton of speculation, theories, and YouTube interviews. I'm going to touch briefly on all of that, but it's not going to be the crux of this episode because it's just so hard to wade through like the rumors and kind of figure out what's actually real and what's not. And I'm trying to just stick to as many of the facts as I can and like the publicly released timeline and things that we actually know about Sebastian and his family. Before we get started, though, one more, quick little announcement. We have had some folks join us over on Patreon, so I definitely want to make sure I gave them a shout out. I have paused our Patreon since we've been like on this little, unexplained absence because I don't want people to start paying, for something that we're not delivering. But I do want to make sure to give these people a shout out. So thank you to Tammy K, Taylor C, and Melissa B. We really appreciate you.
Thank you all so very, very much.
Yes, and we'll be getting all that back to normal soon. Okay, so business out of the way. Let's get into the case of Sebastian Rogers. Sebastian Wayne Drake Rogers was born on December 7th, 2008 to Seth Rogers and Katie Rogers. Katie and Seth were married in the summer of 2008, and the family resided in San Diego, California. Katie was an E5 in the Navy and was part of her shipboard security force. Katie was often deployed, so Seth became a stay-at-home dad. Now, as I mentioned in the intro, it has been reported that Sebastian is on the autism spectrum, and according to Seth, he was also diagnosed with a rare condition called 6q27 chromosomal deletion syndrome.
Boy, that was a mouthful. What does that mean?
So I obviously had no idea. And this came up in some divorce documentation. And Seth, in that documentation, gave his explanation of like what that was. But, I wanted to look it up because I had never heard of it. So according to the National Institute of Health, this condition can cause intellectual insufficiency, facial dysmorphism, seizures, hypotonia, multiple malformations, and brain abnormalities. Now, there are different degrees of severity, so a person who has this may or may not experience all of these issues. They can experience some or not, and not others. They can also experience them to varying degrees. Some sources also say that behavioral issues can also arise, and according to those court documents I mentioned, Seth does make this claim in relation to Sebastian. He says, quote, "Among the symptoms he suffers from are incidents of acting out, where he hits and bites himself out of frustration. He has been known to throw himself to the ground during these incidents." End quote. Despite the challenges that Sebastian may have been facing, his mother describes him as a smart, functional boy. However, in the early years of Sebastian's life, Katie and Seth's marriage became strained. By 2016, when Sebastian was 7, Katie and Seth decided to end their marriage. As they argued over terms, the couple both remained in the marital home. Now, this understandably caused a great deal of tension. And depending on who you believe, the tension either led to abuse, lies, or both.
Of Sebastian?
All of the above. So, in August 2016, Katie was granted a temporary restraining order against Seth. This TRO removed Seth from the marital residence. Katie also listed Sebastian as a protected party and obtained a child custody order that forbade Seth from having contact with their son. The claims that Katie made against Seth are extremely difficult to read. I'm not going to get into a lot of detail, but here's one section. Quote, "Since returning from deployment in December, I have witnessed a multitude of events from Seth. I have seen him hit Sebastian in the head, neck, and back. I've witnessed him, when taking his anger out on Sebastian, grab him with both hands, lift his entire body up, and slam him down, then proceed to beat him. He has on many cases whipped him with a belt, not paying attention to where he was hitting because he was so angry." End quote.
Well, that's horrible.
Yeah, it really is. And she does go on and describes more incidents, including an allegation that Sebastian's school called CPS on them. In Seth's reply, he denies Katie's allegations. Essentially, he says that while raising Sebastian was challenging at times, he never became violent with either Sebastian or Katie. By way of proof, he cites a few different things. One is the fact that due to her job, Katie was in good shape and had been taught fighting tactics. Conversely, Seth himself suffered from a number of physical ailments, including 9 herniated discs in his back, a torn meniscus in his left knee, and 3 tears in his right shoulder. He was taking prescription medications for these injuries as well as attending physical therapy. Seth also said in his legal response, quote, "It should be noted that Katie never called the police and Katie never took Sebastian for any medical care as a result of this alleged incident. Katie never took any action whatsoever consistent with a parent whose child has been abused. Katie's allegation that I abused Sebastian in any way is completely false." End quote.
Her not taking Sebastian to the doctor, I mean, that's I don't see that as proof of none of this happening, especially if she's listing herself as a potential victim also.
Mm-hmm.
Being in those situations, you don't react kind of in what would be considered a quote unquote rational way.
We all know of stories of abuse where
Right.
the person is too afraid to get out, too afraid to call the police, too afraid to go to the hospital, whatever. That's not the case every single time,
Right.
but yeah, not doing those things certainly does not mean that the abuse didn't take place.
Now, I am curious, how did he end up with all of these injuries? Like 9 herniated discs? That's a lot.
Yeah, I don't know.
Like, it sounds like he fell off of a horse or something.
I have no idea. Yeah, I never learned what the cause of those was. While these two accounts are, he said, she said to an extent, Katie did back hers up with photos of injuries on Sebastian that she claims were caused by Seth, as well as audio recordings of the alleged abuse. Now, I haven't heard the audio recordings. I've just seen mention of them in the court documents. And another interesting dynamic between Katie and Seth, which I actually didn't know at the time that I was reading these documents, was their ages. While Seth portrays Katie as basically like the person wearing the pants in the marriage, when she became pregnant with Sebastian, she was only 18.
Oh.
And she was 19 when he was born. And Seth was around 30.
Oh. Yikes.
Yeah.
Okay.
So again, that age difference, like 11 years, whatever, isn't a huge red flag if somebody is in their 50s and another one's in their 40s.
Right.
Like, the power differential between 19 and 30 is huge.
Yeah. Yeah, very much so. That could very easily slip into an abusive situation or a controlling situation.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, it doesn't matter what you do for a living,
No.
what your job is, your level of physical fitness, or, these other claims that he's making. Like, you have an extreme power differential. There's a very large size differential between the two of them as well. So just physically, I mean, there's a lot going on here. While all of this was happening, another man named Chris Proudfoot was also in the Navy and working in San Diego. He was married to a woman named Nina Gomez. Nina had 2 young children from a previous relationship. Now, I don't know when Chris and Katie met, if they knew each other in San Diego, like if they, worked together. I mean, they both worked in the Navy, but a lot of people are on a base, it doesn't mean every single one of them. But at some point, they both ended up in Hendersonville, Tennessee. Now, the timeline, like I said, of all of this is fuzzy, but since Seth and Katie filed for divorce in California, I do think that they were divorced in California and then sometime later ended up in Tennessee. So like after the divorce. Chris Proudfoot and his wife Nina were married when they moved to Tennessee. But according to an interview that Nina did on YouTube, that's where everything began to fall apart. She said that she and Chris had already begun to have problems, and many of them were centered around the way that he treated her children. She said that he was harsh with them and would make them stand in the corner, and he was also quick to spank them when he felt that they stepped out of line. So again, these are his stepchildren. These are very young kids.
Yeah.
Now, despite all of these issues, Nina did become pregnant. Now, according to her, Chris was angry with this news and tried to convince her to get an abortion. She refused, and Nina went to Albuquerque, New Mexico to stay with her parents. She says that she had the baby on her own, but that her daughter ended up in the NICU shortly after her birth due to jaundice. So it was during this NICU stay, she was in there for like a week, I think, that Chris's mother came down to visit the baby with her brother. So the mom, Chris, the grandma's brother. And Nina began to feel uneasy. She believed that Chris was making a plan with his mother to get their daughter away from her. Now, this fear came true when Nina was served with a restraining order and was not allowed to see her daughter. Unfortunately, I don't have any documentation or specific information on that. It's just kind of coming from this interview that I mentioned. But what I do know is that it kicked off a custody battle that continues to this very day. Chris and Nina's daughter primarily resides with Nina in New Mexico, but Chris does have some sort of visitation. And the little girl, who is now 7, has a bedroom at his home in Tennessee, where he lives with his new wife, Katie.
Got it.
Yes. So Katie is now Katie Proudfoot, and Sebastian lived in the home with Chris and Katie, and Seth ended up moving to Tennessee as well, presumably so he could be close to Sebastian.
Okay.
So he has visitation. I don't know, the exact arrangements, but
sure,
he's around, but Sebastian primarily lives with Chris and Katie.
Got it. Okay.
And then Chris has this other daughter who primarily lives in New Mexico, but again, has a bedroom at their house. Now, I know this is all like really confusing, so I hope that you stuck with me and I kind of brought it around here. According to reports, the behavior that Nina alleges Chris showed to her children is the same behavior that he showed toward Sebastian.
Yeah, I was wondering if that was going to come up.
Yep. Chris allegedly used a belt to discipline his stepson. And I said allegedly, but that part he actually did admit to on Nancy Grace.
He admitted to beating his stepson with a belt.
Yeah. Neighbors have also claimed that Sebastian has been made to sleep on a mattress in their garage as punishment.
Okay.
CPS has also been called to the Proudfoot home, but, it's a CPS case. Like, we don't have details on that. If, you're believing Katie's story, right, the original story that she gave in the divorce documents, it seems as though she left one abusive person for another. And
which is common.
Yeah, of course. And there have been myriad custody issues, both with Katie, Seth, and Sebastian, and Chris, Nina, and their daughter, right? And so this has just been going on for years in one way or another. And it seems as though it's all been kind of coming to a head in the past year or so. Because, according to Nina, Chris had started to fight for full custody of their daughter. And according to Seth, Chris wanted Sebastian out of his house.
Oh. So Chris wants his daughter full time, but he wants his stepson out.
Yep.
Nice guy.
Yeah, seems cool. And, so the interview that Nina gave, she's like, I have no idea why he's, fighting me. Like, she lives with me in New Mexico. She always has. Like, I think she thinks it's kind of more of a control thing than anything else,
100%.
Yeah. In an interview with Court TV, Seth said that Chris had approached him about having full custody of Sebastian. Now, the way Seth describes it, Seth was more than willing to take his son and had even begun the process of enrolling him in school at his home for the next school year.
Okay.
But in that interview, he said something that I find extremely alarming. Seth claims that Chris came to him first and told him, this whole plan, but then said, oh yeah, but I got to get Katie on board with the idea.
What?
Yeah. So the stepfather went behind his wife's back to get his stepson out of their home.
Without even talking to his wife?
I guess, presumably so that his daughter could live with him full time and he wouldn't have to deal with Sebastian anymore.
Wow.
Yeah. Which is just wild. I mean, you're a stepfather. If I found out that you ever went to my kid's dad and was like trying to do some backroom custody deal,
that's wild.
I cannot imagine.
No, that's crazy.
Yeah. Now, this obviously paints Chris in an extremely negative light. In fact, many people have theorized that Chris went a step further to get rid of Sebastian himself. And, the timing is interesting, right? Sebastian went missing in the early hours of February 26, 2024. And according to Nina, their next scheduled custody hearing was on or around March 5th. This Court TV interview that I mentioned that we'll link to, it does talk about how a lot of times when you have situations like domestic abuse incidents and murders and things of that nature, a lot of time there is a date involved, something's coming up that triggers it. You know what I mean? Yeah. And so they're, they're thinking, okay, well, this was coming up, so maybe he's just trying to get rid of him. But I don't know. I mean, the actions surrounding the whole deal he was trying to make with Seth are certainly alarming, but if his goal was to get full custody of his daughter, Sebastian going missing is one of the worst things that could happen.
Yeah, I didn't want to say anything about that, but yeah, I mean, it's not a good look when you have a child disappear from your house.
Right. And, we've talked about this in cases of missing children before, where in a case where there are siblings, right? A child goes missing. Most of the times, the other children, they stay in the home. They don't get removed from the home unless police suspect that something bigger is going on within the home. And we saw that with Orrin and Orson West when Jacqueline and Trezelle's other children were removed that day. Right.
Yeah.
But typically the remaining kids do stay with the parents. But if you're going through a custody battle, it's not going to work in your favor.
Yeah. There's no logic to that.
Exactly. Because what family court judge in their right mind is going to send a 7-year-old to live in another state in a home where a child just went missing in the middle of the night under very odd circumstances?
I'm curious about something.
Yeah.
Do you think that Chris might have mentioned something to Sebastian about him possibly going to live with his father?
I would say that that's definitely a possibility.
So I'm wondering, Sebastian hears this.
Mm-hmm.
If the allegations of child abuse are true, then he has those memories of what it was like to live with his dad, and then he left on his own.
Yeah, and that's a big theory that people, have been putting out there since the beginning of this, especially once we did start to kind of learn more about the background of these families.
Because it's like he's in a damned if you do, damned if you don't situation. Because clearly, if the allegations against Chris are to be believed also, then he's going from one bad situation to another bad situation.
Right.
So maybe the mentality at that point is just leave.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's like I said, that there are a lot of people who do believe that's exactly what happened here. I've talked about him kind of disappearing in the middle of the night, but let's talk about the actual circumstances around his disappearance. So according to Katie and Chris, the family had a normal day together on February 25th, which was a Sunday. They ran errands, went shopping, and had popcorn at home. That evening, Sebastian took out the trash, which is one of his chores, and he went to his room to go to bed at around 9 p.m. According to one interview with the YouTube channel Chronicles of Olivia, Katie said, quote, "He was doing something in his room because about an hour later, I heard some noise and I was like, I don't care what you're doing in there, but go to sleep. At 6 o'clock, I went to wake him for school Monday morning, and that's when he wasn't there." End quote. Once Katie saw that Sebastian's room was empty, she said that she looked around the house for him in case he had, just gotten up early or whatever. But she found no sign of her son. At that point, she jumped in the car and drove around the neighborhood looking for him. She drove by the school, getting more and more hysterical. Once she didn't see him outside, Chris called the police. Law enforcement immediately took the report seriously, in large part due to Sebastian being on the autism spectrum. At approximately 11:16 a.m., the Tennessee Bureau of Investigation issued an endangered child alert on behalf of the Sumner County Sheriff's Office. When Sebastian went to his room the night before, he was said to have been wearing black sweatpants, a black sweatshirt, and his glasses. Alarmingly, his shoes were still by the door where he had left them the day before, and none of his belongings, including his Nintendo Switch, appeared to be missing.
Okay. I have questions.
Yeah.
Do we know the layout of the house?
Yeah.
Where is his room? Is it ground floor?
No, so all of the bedrooms are on the same floor. They're all on the upper level.
Okay.
But, and I can't remember which is which, Sebastian's room is on the other side of the house. I can't remember if his room is the only room that faces the front of the house or if his room is the only room that faces the back of the house. But it's one of the two.
Either way, it's on the second floor. So
yeah, they're all on the same floor, but like on the opposite side of the house.
Second floor, so him going out a window, not very realistic.
No, it doesn't seem like it.
Okay. Do we have Ring cameras, doorbell cameras, anything like that?
We do. And they don't see much of anything. There has been one video that's been released, which we'll talk about in a second. But it's interesting because it does seem as though because Katie worked in like security in the Navy that she usually did have a bunch of cameras, but they didn't catch anything or they weren't on or something. There's been, yeah, I know, a little
slightly
suspicion with
there.
the cameras. Yeah.
What is the backyard or the neighborhood like? Is it?
It's a large single family homes. It's a very nice neighborhood, but the homes aren't like right on top of each other, but you can see the neighbors,
So if he goes out the back, presumably it's not like their house doesn't back to a wooded area where he could just jump into the woods.
Okay, yeah, I just looked up the house again. Sebastian's bedroom's in the front, the other bedrooms are in the back, and his house it's basically like ours where you've got neighbors on either side, neighbors across the street, and then their backyard butts up to somebody else's yard. So here's the aerial view.
Gotcha. So, I mean, it wouldn't be easy for him to just like slip out and disappear into the night, so to speak, without at least appearing on somebody's Ring camera, doorbell camera,
right.
Maybe.
Yeah, because you would have to pass a bunch of houses to really get anywhere. The one thing that I will say is that this neighborhood is basically pitch black at night.
Okay.
So in terms of like anybody physically seeing him walking out there, especially if he's dressed in all black, like I can totally buy why they wouldn't, And I think even depending on, how far away he is from the other houses, he might not get picked up on some of the doorbell cameras, because like if he goes out of his room, which is in the front of the house, and then goes on that street that's directly in front of it, likely the other doorbell cameras wouldn't pick him up because, like with ours, we have the sensitivity set specifically so that it doesn't go off every single time a car goes in the road in front of our house.
Right.
So I would imagine a lot of people have that too. So, you can kind of see why he might not have gotten picked up.
Yeah. Him not taking his shoes, I find that less concerning than him not taking anything, any of his belongings. So the shoe thing, my thought process is he's thinking if he has to leave quietly, he's not going to bother necessarily putting his shoes on.
Mm-hmm.
And then he gets outside and doesn't have his shoes and just keeps going.
Yeah.
Him not taking anything is troubling, though.
Right. And, the Switch, the Nintendo Switch keeps on getting mentioned. And I think it's because, it was a very important item to him. Right.
This is obviously something that he uses frequently.
Yeah.
Okay.
That day, a massive search was ordered. According to Sumner County Emergency Management Agency Director Ken Widener, over 200 people were dispatched to search, including multiple K-9 teams, mounted units, helicopter crews, and drones. As I mentioned before, the working theory was that Sebastian had wandered off on his own sometime in the middle of the night. Chris and Katie apparently went to bed around midnight, so it would have been sometime between then and 6 a.m. Searchers blasted Eye of the Tiger, Sebastian's favorite song, in hopes of luring him back. But by the end of the day, they had found not one trace of the missing teenager. The next day, Tuesday, February 22nd, an Amber Alert was issued. Now, the thought behind this was that Sebastian couldn't have gotten too far on his own and on foot in the middle of the night, so someone else must have been involved.
Yeah, I was wondering if they had looked into his internet history, anything that could tie him to somebody else.
Right. Yeah, and I don't know what devices he had, right?
Yeah.
So it doesn't sound like he had a cell phone. I don't know if he had, say, a school-issued Chromebook, for instance, which was one of the devices that was searched in the James Yablonsky case, which we did not too long ago. Nothing's been released about any of that.
Yeah.
Searches continued, and authorities held press conferences urging local residents to check their home surveillance cameras for any sign of Sebastian. They received many tips, but no confirmed sightings. On Thursday, a nearby pond was drained, but thankfully nothing was found. While this was a bit of good news, it was quickly becoming evident that this was going to turn into a much larger case than investigators initially thought. I think initially, like I said, with the theory that he walked away, most investigators thought that, okay, they're either going to find him, lost or just wandering around or hiding or whatever, or worst case scenario,
a body.
Right.
Yeah.
But I think 99% of everybody who is in this initial part of the investigation thought that this was going to be resolved in a day.
Still, kudos to the local law enforcement for gathering such a huge group of people for the initial search.
Yeah, absolutely. So it was incredibly alarming, to investigators that no one had any footage of Sebastian from that night or the next morning. But weirdly, none of the dogs were able to pick up his scent at all.
That's interesting.
Yeah, I read one report that said, I think that it was Seth who said this, that a dog they thought picked up his scent and then went to a construction site, but it turned out to not be correct, or a false alarm or something along those lines.
I mean, that would lead you to believe that he never left the house.
Right, that he was never out there in the first place. Because it's not even like some of the other cases where we've had the dogs pick up the scent and then it stops suddenly.
Right. Which
indicating that person might have gotten into a car. Yeah, so nothing like that from what it sounds like. Sebastian's story was all over local news by this point and had even gone national. And the community was rallying around Sebastian. Hendersonville is near Nashville, and an anonymous group of Nashville business owners got together and offered a $3,500 reward for information leading to Sebastian's return. But by Monday, March 5th, the 1 week mark, precious few clues had been unearthed. At a press conference, Sumner County Sheriff Deputy Chief Eric Craddock announced that they were scaling back the ground search. He told reporters, quote, "This does not diminish our commitment to finding Sebastian. This is simply us transitioning from the ground search to the investigative side," end quote. And he also said that they had no evidence indicating that Sebastian wasn't alive. But this makes total sense. I mean, by this point, they've drained the pond, they've done extensive searches, so they've got to think, well, if he's out here, we would have found him.
Right.
I mean, we're not talking about insane, dense, wooded areas
Right.
or anything like that, you know?
Yeah, and I mean, in some ways, that's almost a promising thing to have happen because they've essentially given up on finding a body. So now they're investigating, like, where he could be.
And like they said, they have no evidence that indicates that, you know, something violent happened in or around the house. So, yeah, I mean,
Right.
I think a lot of them are still thinking he is alive.
So obviously, this is a new case. There's not a whole lot of information being released, but we do know that there's no sign of forced entry in the house, right?
Yeah, no, nothing like that.
At this point, I'm sure that they haven't released who they've interviewed or whether they've cleared anybody family-wise.
Not.
So at this point, everybody is still a suspect.
Yeah.
The only one really having any kind of motive would be Chris.
Right. But then even that doesn't make sense.
No, it doesn't make any logical sense, but he's the only one that slightly has something. So it leads me to go back to my original theory was that he wandered off on his own, but he couldn't have walked out of the house barefoot and the canines not pick up on him.
So yeah, that doesn't make much sense. But even more stuff's going to be uncovered. So Chris and Katie didn't speak publicly about Sebastian's disappearance until March 5th, which made some people suspicious. This suspicion only grew when on Thursday, police announced that they were going to search a landfill in White Plains, Kentucky, which is the landfill where the trash from Sebastian's neighborhood is taken. So when people heard this was again one of like the first things I remember hearing about the case. Many immediately thought that this was an indication that police suspected foul play and that something horrible had happened to Sebastian in or around his home.
Or they're just doing this to rule that out.
Right. And that's basically what police said. They stated that there was no specific information that led them to search the landfill, but that it was just a, quote, precautionary measure to eliminate possible options and questions, end quote. It makes sense because we have unfortunately also had a lot of cases where, you know, people were rumored to have ended up in a landfill, but oftentimes you don't get this information until weeks, months, years later, and it's kind of hard to search. So I think it was really good that they were proactive.
Oh, yeah, 100%.
And searched it as soon as it made sense to search it, right?
Yeah.
Because like that's not something you do on day one.
No,
like that's a little
not.
like over proactive. You
Yeah.
know what I mean? But like I think at this point that's great that they didn't be like, oh hey, it's the 1 year anniversary. I wonder what's at the landfill. You know?
Yeah, and I mean I think it's given the extensive search that they did, I think it's probably safe to assume that they've already searched the house.
Oh yeah. Of course, we just don't have specifics about that, but yes, they definitely went in and did all that. So unfortunately, you know, or fortunately, depending on how you look at it, this search also turned up nothing. Meanwhile, Sebastian's father, Seth, began speaking to the press. Over a series of interviews, he spoke about Sebastian's background and his utter confusion about what could have happened to his son. The first thing he pointed out was how strange it was that Sebastian left without his shoes. Now, obviously, it's strange for anyone to leave the house in the middle of the night without their shoes, but according to Seth, Sebastian really hated being outside in his bare feet. He said that this stemmed from an incident from Sebastian's childhood in which he had stepped on a mound of fire ants while playing outside. So, I mean, I think that's really interesting, though, because there are some people who like go barefoot, you know, who don't care, who do whatever. And to add this extra layer of like, he was scared of being barefoot outside is interesting. However, footage would soon emerge that indicated Sebastian may have done exactly that. On March 14th, security footage was publicly released that showed not a whole lot, really. But in a case that had basically no clues, it was something. The video, taken at 3:10 a.m. on the morning Sebastian was reported missing, shows two specks of light outside Sebastian's home.
Where is this footage from?
It's from a security camera.
Okay.
The lights move in the video, and it began to appear as though the lights were actually two people with flashlights. The two lights moved together before eventually moving off screen.
Interesting.
Yeah, and because this neighborhood is pitch black at night, nothing more could really be determined from the video. Like you couldn't see the people at all. You just saw these two dots of lights, but because they moved together and apart, it was clear that it wasn't like headlights, for instance.
Right.
Chris Proudfoot told reporters that there wasn't anything to be determined from that video because what was captured wasn't actually flashlights. He said, quote, "Everything that everybody is trying to assume is a flashlight. I hate to say this, but it's not. As much as we would love it to be one, it's not." End quote.
I mean, does he say what he thinks it is?
Not
then?
that I saw. So unless I'm missing something, he's like, yeah, it's not a flashlight. But like, doesn't give an alternate explanation.
Like, is he saying that it's fireflies?
I don't know. The TBI didn't come out and like agree with Chris's statement, but they did say, quote, "We do caution that some surveillance video being shared in the public may have been misinterpreted or misidentified or not shown in its entirety." End quote.
Oh, okay.
But of course, they also don't even say what video they're referring to.
Right.
But that's the only surveillance video that's been released. So as the 1 month mark of Sebastian's disappearance approached, his case began to get more and more national attention. Chris and Katie went on Nancy Grace, which I talked about earlier, where Katie said she believed someone had her son. So she did not think that he just walked off in the middle of the night. She thinks that somebody took him, whether it's like a planned meetup, or whatever the circumstances.
Well, I mean, if that's the case, it would have had to have been a planned meetup.
Right. Yeah. I mean, it wasn't just some random person.
Like going into their house without making forced entry.
Exactly. Yeah. And yeah, so her reasoning for this is basically that with the amount of people who had been looking for her son, if he had just wandered off, he would have been found by now. And that's, like I said, the conclusion that the police kind of came to, which is why they started looking in the landfill and backing off on the ground search. Nancy Grace, of course, grilled the Proudfoots about their whereabouts the night Sebastian went missing. And their story stayed basically the same. He took the trash out, he went to bed, like we went to bed at, 12:15. Though Katie did clarify that the sound she heard coming from Sebastian's room that night was a thud.
Okay. Potentially indicating what, though?
I don't know. But that's the only thing that was different, I guess, from the initial story. Which it's not that it was different as in, like, she's changing her story. She just clarified what the noise was.
Yeah.
I've read a lot of things that have been like, oh, well, if it was a thud, like, why didn't she go check on him? She's a terrible mother. I feel like we hear thuds and stuff from our kids' rooms like all the time. And I absolutely ignore them.
Yeah. Because they're just kids being kids in their room.
This is also the interview where Chris admits to beating Sebastian with a belt. But he did claim that it had only happened once. Oh, wait. I didn't remember this part when you asked me how old Sebastian was. He says it was about 3 years ago. And he said that it happened after Sebastian lied.
Okay. His stepson is 10 years old and he beats him with a belt.
But only once.
Uh-huh.
Because he lied.
Only once.
Like, give me a break. I'm sorry. I mean, if you've been, and again, I don't know exactly how long they've been together. But I'm thinking they've been together since Sebastian was like 8 or 9. And so you're going to tell me that like 3 years into it, you're like, oh my God, you lied. I'm going to hit you with a belt for the first time.
Yeah.
And then for the next 3 years, it'll never happen again.
All of that just seems fishy.
Yeah. Again, I can't help but go back to Katie's divorce papers in which she claimed that Seth had also beaten Sebastian with a belt. So, what you were saying earlier about him just being in 2 terrible situations. Yeah, that's kind of what it sounds like.
All of this leads me back to he had this mindset and he figured out a way to make plans to get out.
Mm-hmm.
Then there's got to be some sort of internet history of
right.
him talking to somebody about meeting up and making plans to get out.
Mm-hmm. So since this case has begun, people have been really kind of staking out Chris and Katie's house, just like trying to learn more about them and things. And the two of them have an RV, and reporters like saw them pack up and leave. And so when they were on Nancy Grace, she asked them about this, and they confirmed that they had left their home in Hendersonville, but said that this was something that had been planned prior to Sebastian's disappearance. According to LinkedIn, after leaving the Navy, Chris got a job as a crane operator. So apparently, and again, I don't know much about crane operation, like as a career, in so much as, how that works. Like, do you travel, what your shifts are like? But apparently his job site was not local. It wasn't in Hendersonville. And so a lot of times it sounds like they would pack up their RV and then go to wherever the job was. And like Katie would go with them. And they kind of just live there for however long he was on that job site.
Yeah, I mean, that makes sense.
Yeah. And so I do believe that makes sense, like in general. The part that I struggle with is, that a lot of people struggle with is like, this is a month and a half, however long after your 15-year-old son went missing.
Yeah, for sure. Definitely odd behavior, but I mean, I would hate to say this, but life doesn't stop. They have to make money.
Yeah,
if he's a crane operator, I would imagine that's not, a steady income. It's you get paid when you work.
Yeah.
So.
Right. And I don't know their financial situation,
no, right.
Whatever. Like, I don't want to get too much into like the, well, she should have done this. She should have done this kind of things with Katie either in terms of stuff like that. But it is what it is. They left. Like, they packed up the RV and they left their house. So Seth, was making the media rounds during this time, and during all these like various interviews, it quickly became clear that the trio did not have a united front. In his interviews, it seems as though Seth feels like he's the only one who's really trying to find Sebastian. He was on the ground looking for him and handing out flyers while Chris and Katie left town and, just seemingly resumed their life. In a court TV interview, Seth also made some shocking allegations against Katie. Namely, that this wasn't the first time something horrible had happened to Sebastian on her watch. So remember the divorce documents we spoke about? In those, Seth stated that Katie had made him leave the marital home. Again, the timeline of this is all fuzzy, but from what it sounds like, based on Seth's statement here, it sounds like the marital home was sold, during the divorce, right? And then before they all moved to Tennessee, Katie and Sebastian had an apartment in San Diego. So it was while they were living in this apartment, when Sebastian was around 8 years old, that he was playing with another boy who was 13 at the time. According to Seth, the older boy sexually assaulted Sebastian.
Oh.
Seth was later informed of the assault, but was not given the boy's last name. There was also never a court case because, according to Seth, the prosecutors declined to press charges due to the boy's young age.
Interesting.
Yeah, Seth said that all he was able to really do was connect CPS to the school administration of where the older boy went to school, so that they could kind of help protect other kids that the boy, would be around. But that's really all that came of it. It also doesn't sound as though Sebastian really got therapy. I think Seth might have said he was in therapy for a little while or something along those lines, but it doesn't. It just seems like a terrible time all around.
Yeah, for sure.
In the same court TV interview, Seth claims that Katie also later left Sebastian alone with a registered sex offender.
What?
Yeah, now this person had previously served several years in prison, but even though their debt was, technically paid, like Seth said in the interview, you just don't do that.
No.
So who is the sex offender that Katie allowed around her child? Like, and why? And what is the context of this? Well, I was pretty shocked when I read this. It's her mother, Frances Rosenbaum.
Oh my. Okay.
Yeah. In 2002, Frances was convicted of sexual abuse of a minor by a parent or guardian.
So Katie?
No, I don't think so. I don't think it was Katie, but it was somebody. And yes, obviously this was years before Sebastian was even born, but that's a pretty bad charge.
Yeah.
Not somebody you would really want around your child, even if it is his grandparent.
Yeah, I mean...
Or maybe especially because it's
especially
his grandparents.
because, yeah. I mean, especially given the circumstances of the charges.
Yeah. So Seth is like on court TV telling these stories. And then the host asked him if he thought that Katie was a good mother. And he said, in my opinion, no.
Sure. I mean, he's allowed to state his opinion.
Yeah, of course. I didn't know any of this before I started researching this episode. Like the stuff about the previous assault in San Diego, the sex offender thing. Like I hadn't heard any of that. I just watched that interview in the course of researching this episode. But the first time I heard about Katie's mother was when I learned about the photo that I mentioned in the intro. At the beginning of May, a photo began circulating online. It was of a boy who looks shockingly like Sebastian in front of a visitor center at Grandfather Mountain in North Carolina. The resemblance to Sebastian was so strong that not only did random folks on the internet believe that it could be the missing teen, but his father, Seth, went on News Nation with Elizabeth Vargas and said that he also believed this was a picture of his son. Seth went on to say that because he believed this photo was of his son and it was taken in a different state, that he was hopeful the FBI would get involved. And when he says get involved, I think he means like basically take the lead, because the FBI has been involved kind of somewhat in this case, just like on a very, very, basic consulting kind of level.
Okay.
But it's really the Sumner County Sheriff's Office and the TBI, the Tennessee Bureau of Investigation, who are leading this investigation. He also stated in this interview that he went to the visitor center in hopes of watching the surveillance video, but by the time he got there, police had instructed them, them being the visitor center, not to release it to anyone because of the pending investigation.
Yeah, we don't know what they found on there, so.
Right. And so that, made Seth hopeful, because he was like, well, if it was nothing, then police wouldn't have said that, like if it was like obviously a hoax, or if the photo was photoshopped online,
Yeah.
So like he got hopeful because he wasn't allowed to see the surveillance video.
Right. But at the same time, I'm sure it's frustrating because
oh, yeah, of course.
he wants to see it. He wants to get involved in the investigation, but he can't because we don't know yet.
Right. So from what I understand, the photo itself was taken by another visitor who knew about the Sebastian Rogers case. Like they were apparently there. They were rushing to meet family members, saw this person, took a picture, wasn't sure, and then stopped and looked at it and kind of became convinced, right? Now, this person allegedly did send the photo into law enforcement, but didn't hear back right away. So that's why they decided to release it on social media. Now, Seth doesn't talk about this in the News Nation interview that I spoke about earlier, but the full version of this photograph, which I've seen on social media, in it, there's an older blonde woman near Sebastian. And just the way the picture is, you can't really tell if he's with her or if she just happened to have been like walking by at the time the photo was taken. But several people pointed out the fact that this woman looked like Katie's mother.
Yeah, I was wondering if that's where we were going with this.
And so this led to speculation that Katie and her family were hiding Sebastian for some reason.
Yeah, but why?
Yeah, exactly. Like, no idea. I mean, to protect him from Chris, maybe, let's say. because she thought Chris was going to do something to Sebastian to keep him from going to Seth, because Chris was, trying to get Seth to have full custody. Like, I don't know.
Just seems like if that were the case, that the easier solution would be for Katie to leave Chris and retain full custody.
Yeah. Now, police didn't immediately go public and say that the photo wasn't of Sebastian. I want to say a full week passed, right? Where police weren't saying anything. Like, and, in a situation like this, if they have something, they're not going to say anything.
Yeah.
So, like, a lot of people are like, holy shit, this case might be solved, in a matter of days. But unfortunately, on May 7th, 2024, the Sumner County Sheriff's Office released a statement confirming that the photo was not of Sebastian Rogers. They were apparently able to make contact with the boy in the photograph and his family and, positively identify them.
Which I guess would then lead to the surveillance footage not showing anything also.
Exactly. While this was a crushing blow to the case, it did help get Sebastian's name out there again, because this was a huge story.
Yeah.
So this really got a lot of national attention. Chris, Seth, and Katie have continued to make appearances on different YouTube channels to the point where people are accusing them of hurting the case. And honestly, that's kind of what I said. I can't go down all of that because it's a lot. And I don't know how useful any of it is.
Yeah.
But it's a delicate balance, right? Because, the family of a missing person needs to get publicity. They need to help keep their loved one's name out there as much as possible, so that people don't just move on to the next thing and forget about this person who's missing. But then, when you go on too many of these, and what too many is, who can say, but then people are really going to start picking apart everything about you, everything about what you say, about what you do, about what you're not doing. It just is tough. And it brings so much noise to the case that oftentimes, it is easy for the actual missing person to kind of get lost in the mix, or for the actual facts of the case to even get lost in the mix. But Seth has vowed to not let his son's case go cold. The 3-month mark of Sebastian going missing passed shortly before we're recording this. To mark that occasion, Seth planned additional ground searches. He told reporters, quote, "When people stop looking, when people lose faith, it becomes a cold case, and I am not going to lose faith. I think everybody's helping to keep the faith, keep the prayers strong," end quote. In 3 months, the Sumner County Sheriff's Office, the Tennessee Bureau of Investigation, and the FBI have all been involved in this investigation to some extent. Hundreds of tips and/or sightings have been submitted. Internet sleuths and YouTube psychics have been working overtime, but no hard evidence has emerged about what exactly happened to Sebastian Rogers in the early morning hours of February 26th. Police have said that they have no evidence of foul play, no evidence that any of his family members are involved with his disappearance, and no real evidence that he left on his own. Sebastian Rogers appears to have just vanished, but people don't just vanish, especially 15-year-old kids who don't even have their shoes on. We don't know what happened to Sebastian, but hopefully, as his case keeps getting more attention and his face stays out in public, we'll have some answers soon. Sebastian Rogers has been missing from Hendersonville, Tennessee since February 26, 2024. Sebastian is a white male with dirty blonde hair. He was last seen wearing a sweatshirt and black sweatpants. If you've seen Sebastian or have info about his whereabouts, please call the Sumner County Sheriff's Office at 615-451-3838 or the TBI at 1-800-TBI-FIND. You can see all the sources for this episode along with photos and videos at our website, andthentheywere.gone.com.
And be sure to follow us on social, and Then They Were Gone Pod on Facebook and at ATTWG Pod on Instagram and TikTok. If you like what we're doing, please subscribe and consider leaving a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts. It will help new listeners find us. And the more people that listen, the more chances we have of bringing someone home.
And we'll see you here next week for a brand new episode.
See you next week.
And Then They Were Gone is hosted by Kona Gallagher and Ethan Flick. All research, writing, and editing is done by me, Kona Gallagher. Theme music is The Stork by Ketsa. Additional music is provided by Kai Engel. And Then They Were Gone is a Little Monster production.
Hey, you can do it!